He grabbed her by the hair. Not by the arm, not by the wrist, by the hair. The way a man grabs something he doesn't consider human. Edward Holloway's fingers twisted into Zuri Bennett's braids and dragged her backward across the marble floor of his pantry while his poker guests laughed somewhere beyond the closed kitchen door. She'd dropped a crystal decanter. $40 whiskey soaking into a $40,000 rug. That was the crime. That was all it took. His fist connected with her ribs twice before she hit the shelving unit, and the sound that came out of her wasn't a scream. It was something smaller, more broken, the sound of a person who has learned that screaming only makes it worse. He locked the door on his way out. She lay there on the cold tile, breathing in shallow pulls, tasting blood, listening to the ice clink in glasses on the other side of the wall. If that had been you, if you were the one on that floor, who would you call? If you're new here, subscribe now and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Because what happens next inside that locked pantry, and who answers the phone when Zuri finally makes that call, will change everything you think you know about power, mercy, and what it means to be truly seen. The rain had been coming down since 6 in the evening, and by 9 it had turned the city into something unrecognizable. East Harbor wasn't a gentle place under the best conditions. The waterfront district ran on container shipping, cold storage facilities, and the kind of money that never showed up on a tax return. The streets near the docks smelled like diesel and brine, even on dry days. On a night like this one, with gutters running brown and the harbor lights fracturing across every puddle, it felt like the whole city was dissolving from the edges inward. Zuri Bennett had lived in this city for 11 years and had never once felt like it belonged to her. She arrived at the Holloway estate every morning at 7:15 by bus, transferred twice, walked 4 blocks in whatever weather the sky decided to deliver. She let herself in through the service entrance using a code that changed monthly without anyone bothering to tell her until she'd already stood at the door for 10 minutes. She cleaned rooms that were never really dirty because no one lived in them, polished silverware that no one ate with, maintained the illusion of a household that functioned like a home when it was really just a stage set for a man who needed the world to believe he was something other than what he was. Edward Holloway was 61 years old, worth somewhere between $300 and $400 million depending on which quarterly report you believed, and he had the specific cruelty of men who have never once in their adult lives been told no by someone they couldn't fire or buy. Zuri had learned his rhythms the way a person learns the patterns of weather in a dangerous climate. She knew when his meetings ran long and left him brittle. She knew the particular quality of silence that settled over the house when he was drinking before noon. She knew the sound of his footsteps on the upper landing, quick and deliberate when he was in a manageable mood, slow and dragging when he wasn't. She had built an entire survival system out of reading the atmosphere of that house, and it had kept her employed and relatively untouched for 3 years. But survival systems have gaps. And Zuri found one that night. The poker game had been going since 7. 6 men, the kind of men who referred to themselves as self-made, while standing in rooms their grandfathers built, arranged around the felt-top table in Holloway's study. She'd been assigned to keep the drinks filled, the ashtrays emptied, and herself invisible. That last part she was good at. She had spent the better part of her adult life perfecting the specific posture of a woman the room agrees not to see. It was the decanter that broke it. The Waterford crystal one, a gift from some European business contact, displayed on the sideboard with the quiet arrogance of objects that exist to remind you of their own value. Zuri had been reaching for a bottle of bourbon behind it when her elbow clipped the edge, and the decanter went off the shelf in what felt like slow motion and landed on the marble surround of the fireplace in what was very definitely not slow motion. The sound it made was spectacular. The room went silent. Holloway didn't yell. That was the thing people who'd never met him didn't understand. He didn't yell. He went very, very still. He stood up from his chair slowly, the way a man stands up when he's certain he has all the time in the world. He told his guests to excuse him for just a moment. He walked across the room to where Zuri stood frozen in the wreckage of the decanter. He looked at the glass on the floor. He looked at her. He said, very quietly, "Come with me." She knew better than to argue. He walked her through the kitchen to the pantry at the back, one hand on her shoulder. Not gripping, not yet, just there, like a leash held loosely. He closed the pantry door behind them. The laughter from the study filtered through the walls, muffled and distant. She tried to apologize. She got 3 words out. That was when his hand moved to her hair. What he did in that pantry lasted less than 90 seconds. It felt much longer. By the end of it, she was on the floor between a shelving unit of dry goods and a stack of folded tablecloths, one arm braced against the lowest shelf, trying to breathe through pain that told her something structural had given way. He hadn't hit her face, he knew enough to avoid her face. But her ribs had taken two direct impacts, and her shoulder had caught the corner of the shelf when she went down, and the room was tilting slightly in a way that scared her. He straightened his cuffs. He told her she'd be docking the cost of the decanter from her next 3 paychecks. He unlocked the pantry door, left it locked from the outside, and walked back to his poker game. She heard him laugh at something one of the guests said before she heard anything else at all. Zuri sat on the pantry floor for what she estimated was about 10 minutes, though her sense of time had become unreliable. She ran an inventory of her body the way she'd learned to do. The cold, practical accounting of damage that you learn when you've spent enough time in situations where panic is a luxury you can't afford. Left side ribs? Bad. Possibly worse than bad. Every breath came with a catching quality, a hesitation at the top of her lungs that she recognized as the warning sign before something became serious. Right shoulder, swollen and stiffening. The back of her head where his fist had connected, tender, but not the nauseating throb of a concussion. She was not okay. But she was conscious, she was functional. The question was what to do with that. Her phone was in her apron pocket. She could call 911. She sat with that option for a moment and let herself think through what that actually looked like. A squad car pulling up to a Holloway estate, officers she'd never met speaking to a billionaire they all recognized, her word against a man whose charitable foundation had a wing named after it at the city's largest hospital. She thought about the last time a woman she knew had called the police after something like this. She thought about how that had ended. She put that option down carefully, like setting a glass on an unsteady surface. There was another phone in her pocket. She'd almost forgotten it was there. It was a cheap prepaid thing, a burner with no case and a cracked screen protector, and she'd been carrying it for 3 weeks without quite understanding why. It had appeared in her kitchen, not the Holloway kitchen, but her own kitchen in her apartment in the East Side Flats. On a Wednesday afternoon when she'd come home from work to find a folded note and the phone sitting on her kitchen table next to her coffee maker. The note had said, "In case you ever need a ride. One button, don't lose it. It hadn't been signed. It hadn't needed to be." 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday night that had also involved rain, Zuri had been in the Holloway kitchen at an unusual hour. Holloway had called an emergency household staff meeting for 8 p.m., which meant her bus ride home became a 9:30 problem instead of a 7:15 problem. And she'd stayed late to reset the dining room after a dinner that had run long. She'd been alone in the kitchen when the service entrance opened. The man who came through it wasn't anyone's idea of a guest. He was tall, Korean, probably mid-30s, wearing a suit that cost more than her monthly rent in a color she'd describe as somewhere between charcoal and black. His left hand was pressed against his right side, just below the rib cage, and when he moved the hand briefly to close the door behind him, she could see the dark stain spreading through the white of his dress shirt. He'd looked at her. She'd looked at him. She had understood several things simultaneously. That this man was hurt, that he was not supposed to be here, that he was almost certainly the kind of man about whom people used words like dangerous and connected in the same sentence, that whatever had brought him through her employer's service entrance at 8:30 on a Tuesday night was not something she wanted detailed knowledge of. She had also understood, on some frequency below conscious thought, that he was trying very hard not to show how much pain he was in and that he was failing, and that there was something deeply human about watching a person fight to hold their composure when their body was actively betraying them. She'd gone to the linen closet without saying a word. She'd come back with a folded hand towel, fresh, the good Egyptian cotton that Holloway imported from somewhere she could never pronounce. She'd handed it to him. He'd looked at the towel for a moment, then at her. "Thank you," he'd said. 2 words. Quiet. Not the way powerful men usually said thank you, which was typically indistinguishable from a dismissal. The way a person says it when they mean it. She'd gone back to resetting the dining room. She hadn't asked his name, she hadn't asked what happened. When she came back through the kitchen 15 minutes later, he was gone. The only evidence was a faint smear on the edge of the counter near the door. 3 days after that, she'd come home to the burner phone on her kitchen table. She had not asked herself too many questions about how he'd gotten into her apartment. That kind of question led to places she wasn't ready to go. She'd put the phone in her apron pocket the next morning and had carried it every day since, And on some level, she'd known, the way you know things you don't let yourself say out loud, that she was carrying it because the situation she was in had been building towards something for a long time. And the day it arrived, she was going to need something she didn't currently have. That day was tonight, and the phone was in her pocket. She pressed the single button. It rang twice. Yeah. One word, no inflection. The voice of a man who had answered phones in the middle of the night so many times it had stopped meaning anything to him. Except that it meant something, now. She could hear it in the very specific quality of the silence that followed his greeting, the way he went still on the other end of the line. It's... Her voice came out wrong, thin, scraped. She tried again. It's Zuri, from the kitchen. A beat. I know who it is. I need... She stopped. The words were harder to organize than she expected. Pain did that. It took your thoughts and shuffled them. I need a ride. The silence on his end lasted 3 seconds. She counted them. Where are you? Still at the house, the pantry, in the back of the kitchen. She paused to breathe through a catch in her ribs. He locked it. Another silence, but different from the first one. The first silence had been calibration. This one was something she didn't have a word for. Are you hurt? She almost said, I'm fine. It was reflexive, the way it is for people who've spent years saying it regardless of whether it was true. She stopped herself. Yes. How bad? I don't know, my ribs, I fell. She left out the part about how she fell. She didn't know why she left it out. Maybe because she was still in the man's house and saying it out loud felt like it would make it more real than she could currently handle. Can you walk? I think so. Stay on the phone. She heard movement on his end, quick, purposeful, the sound of a man who had made a decision and was already in the process of executing it. Voices in the background too low to make out words. 17 minutes. He has security. The whole house. 17 minutes, he said again. Not a reassurance. A fact. The way you state a fact you are personally going to ensure becomes true. She believed him. She wasn't entirely sure why she believed him. She had spent her adult life learning not to believe the promises of powerful men, and here she was on a cold pantry floor, fractured and frightened, choosing to believe this one. Maybe it was the way he said it. Maybe it was because he hadn't said don't worry, or everything will be fine, or any of the other soft language people deploy when they don't actually intend to do anything. He had said 17 minutes, like 17 minutes was a thing he was going to physically construct and place in front of her. She sat against the shelving unit and breathed, careful and shallow, and listened to the rain hit the kitchen window on the other side of the wall. Upstairs, in the study, the poker game continued. Someone made a joke. The laughter came through the floor in waves. She looked at the locked pantry door. She thought about the woman she'd been before she started working in houses like this one. The woman who'd had opinions about things, who'd had plans, who'd believed that if you worked hard enough and kept your head down and didn't cause trouble, the world would leave you in a condition that resembled dignity. She thought about what she'd traded to believe that, how much of herself she'd made small. The phone in her hand was warm from her palm. On the other end of the line, she could hear the sound of a car engine starting. 12 minutes had already passed. She hadn't noticed them go. She pressed her free hand against her left side, trying to brace the ribs without pressing into them, and she closed her eyes and breathed, and she waited for the sound of something she couldn't yet name. Something arriving through the rain, through the locked door, through the 17 minutes she'd been promised by a man she had no rational reason to trust and every human reason to believe. Outside, the storm didn't slow down. The harbor lights fractured across the water. The city dissolved and didn't stop. And somewhere in the dark, moving fast, something dangerous was already coming. The car was already moving when Dante Seo ended the call. He didn't put the phone away. He kept it in his left hand, screen dark, and stared through the rain-blurred windshield at the city dissolving past him, while his right hand rested on his knee with the particular stillness of a man actively choosing not to make a fist. In the front seat, his driver Jin-ho had already run 2 red lights without being told to. That was the thing about men who'd worked together long enough. You stopped needing to explain what you wanted. Holloway Estate, Dante said. East Quarter, up the ridge. I know it. Service entrance on the south side. Don't stop at the gate. Jin-ho didn't answer. He adjusted the wheel and took a left that compressed everyone in the vehicle against their doors, and the 2 black SUVs trailing them matched the turn without hesitation. In the back seat beside Dante, a man named Rook was already on his own phone, speaking in the clipped half sentences of someone relaying operational information. Rook was 38, built like a man who'd made poor life choices starting at age 14 and had somehow survived all of them. And his specific talent was the ability to move through a situation without ever appearing to hurry, even when he was moving very fast. 6 guards on the exterior rotation, Rook said, lowering his phone. 2 on the gate, 2 on the south perimeter, 1 in the gatehouse, 1 floating. Interior, we don't have a count on. Holloway has a poker night running, his usual crowd. Dante looked at the rain on the window. His security knows his guests. They're going to be relaxed. Relaxed is relative. Relaxed enough. Rook looked at him for a moment. Wasn't a long look, but it carried weight. The kind of look that passes between men who have known each other through enough ugly situations to understand that certain questions don't get asked directly. "This the woman from the kitchen?" Rook said. "Yes." Another pause. "The one you left the phone for?" "Yes." Rook turned back to the window. "Okay," he said. "Just that." Dante picked up his other phone, the real one, not the burner, and made a call to a number that went to voicemail on the first ring, which meant the person on the other end had seen the caller ID and chosen not to answer. He left no message. He sent a text instead, 4 words. "Clear your schedule tomorrow." Then he put that phone away and kept the burner in his hand and watched the city peel past him in the rain. I was thinking about a sound he'd heard on the call. Not what she'd said. The words were straightforward enough. She needed a ride. She was hurt. She was locked in. It was the thing underneath the words. The way she'd breathed. Short, cautious breaths, with a particular timing that he recognized from a specific kind of experience. The timing of a person managing pain they're trying not to show. She hadn't cried. She hadn't screamed or pleaded or apologized for calling. She had simply stated her situation in the flattest voice she could manage and asked for what she needed. He thought about the towel. 3 weeks ago, bleeding through his shirt from a knife that had gotten through what should have been an impenetrable situation, he had come through that service entrance because it was the nearest unlocked door and he needed 30 seconds in a room that wasn't the street. He had expected the kitchen to be empty. He had not expected a woman in an apron to look at him, process everything she was seeing in approximately 4 seconds, and then walk to a closet and come back with a folded towel. No phone call. No scream. No negotiation. Just a towel, handed over with the same matter-of-fact efficiency you'd use to pass someone the salt. He had thought about that moment more times than he was willing to admit. Not because it was complicated, but because it was so extraordinarily simple. In his life, simple human gestures had become so rare they registered like anomalies. The SUV hit the ridge road and the engine note changed as they began the climb. 12 minutes, Jinho said from the front. Dante turned the burner phone over in his hand. Somewhere in a locked pantry in the house at the top of this road, a woman was sitting on a cold floor counting minutes she'd been told to count. He had told her 17. He was going to beat that. He looked at Rook. "I go in through the south. You take the gate team." "And Holloway?" Dante looked back out the window. "He's mine." Inside the pantry, Zuri had stopped counting minutes because counting minutes was making it worse. She'd shifted her position twice, trying to find the arrangement that put the least pressure on her left side, and had settled on sitting with her back against the lower shelving unit, knees drawn up slightly, right arm braced across her ribs from the outside. It didn't help much. It was something to do with her body, while her mind worked through the specific kind of fear that arrives not in a rush, but in increments, like water finding its way through a crack. She was thinking about her sister in Baltimore, who she hadn't called in 6 weeks. She was thinking about the lease on her apartment that came up in February. She was thinking about the very specific fact that she was 32 years old, that she had a GED and a half-finished associate's degree from a community college she'd had to drop when the money ran out, and that she was sitting on the floor of a rich man's pantry at 9:40 p.m. on a rainy Wednesday with fractured ribs waiting for a Korean mob boss to come through the wall. She was thinking, how did this become my life? Not in a self-pitying way, more in the way you look at a route on a map after you've already arrived somewhere wrong, tracing back the turns that got you here. Not because you can undo them, but because understanding them is better than not understanding them. She'd taken the Holloway job because it paid $22 an hour and didn't require references she couldn't provide. She'd stayed because leaving meant finding something else, and finding something else meant the gap in employment, and the gap meant questions she didn't have clean answers to. She'd learned to manage Holloway's moods, and she'd learned to stay out of his way, and she'd told herself that management was the same as safety, which was the kind of lie you tell yourself when the truth is too heavy to carry every day. The truth was that she'd known for over a year that something like tonight was coming. The truth was that she had nowhere else to go. The phone in her hand buzzed once. A text from the burner's single stored contact. Still with you. 6 minutes. She read it twice. Then she looked at the locked door. From the other side of the wall, she could still hear the poker game. Someone was arguing about a hand. Not angry, just the loud competitive arguing of men who were drunk and comfortable, and had never once considered that the woman in their host's pantry might be listening to them through the wall with broken ribs. She thought, 6 minutes. Then she thought, what happens after 6 minutes? Because that was the part she hadn't let herself think about yet. The rescue, if it came, if it was real, wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of a different problem. You didn't call a man like Dante Seo for a ride home. You didn't pull that string without understanding that strings were attached to things, and that things moved when you pulled them. She had no illusions about what he was. She had none of the comfortable fictions that let people in his orbit pretend they were somewhere clean. She'd spent 3 years working in a house where powerful men came and went, and she had learned to read them the way you read weather, by what they left behind, what changed in a room when they entered it, how other men's postures shifted in their presence. The night she'd handed him that towel, she'd read him as clearly as she'd ever read anyone. He was violent. He was controlled. He was, and this was the part she kept coming back to, not cruel in the particular way that men like Holloway were cruel. Holloway was cruel because he could be, because cruelty was a form of entertainment for him, because the people he hurt were objects, and objects existed to absorb whatever a man with money decided to direct at them. The man she'd given the towel to had looked at her with eyes that calculated threat levels, the way other people read room temperature, automatic and constant, and he had seen her clearly enough to decide she wasn't a threat. And in that moment of being seen, she had felt something she hadn't felt in a long time inside that house. Like a person. That was all. Just a person. Not a problem to manage, not a liability, not a pair of hands attached to a name on a payroll. Just a woman standing in a kitchen, and he was just a man who needed a towel. She pressed her hand harder against her ribs and breathed. From outside, far away but getting closer, she thought she heard, or imagined she heard, the particular sound of heavy vehicles moving faster than the road technically allowed. The gate went first. The Holloway Estate's main gate was a wrought iron affair, electronically operated, with a guard station that currently contained one security guard named Marcus, who was 26 years old, had been at this job for 8 months, and was in the middle of a text conversation with a woman he'd met at a bar the previous weekend. He didn't hear the SUVs until they were already through the perimeter hedge on the south side. By the time he looked up from his phone, Rook was already opening the guard station door, and Marcus had enough time to start a sentence before the conversation ended. He wasn't hurt. Rook didn't hurt people who weren't in the way. He was zip-tied to his chair with his phone face down on the console and left in a situation that was embarrassing but survivable. The south perimeter guard lasted slightly longer, primarily because he actually saw the vehicles coming and managed to get a radio call out, half a call, clipped off, the kind of transmission that is itself the message, before 2 of Dante's men materialized from opposite sides of the hedgerow and took the situation in hand. Inside the guard station, the radio buzzed with the clipped fragment. The floating guard, a thick-necked former cop named DeSalvo, who had worked Holloway's detail for 4 years, and who had, unlike his younger colleagues, genuinely developed an instinct for when something was wrong, heard it, and went immediately rigid. He keyed his radio. South. Repeat. Static. Marcus, you there? Static. DeSalvo was already moving. He was a professional, and he did the professional thing, which was to get to his principal first and assess later. He took the back stairs 2 at a time toward the study, radio in one hand and the other hand at his hip. He mought it to the study door in 45 seconds, which was fast, and he knocked twice in the specific pattern that meant immediate security concern, and Holloway's voice said what in the particular tone of a man who didn't like being interrupted. DeSalvo opened the door. Sir, I need you to come with... The window across the room exploded inward. Not exploded. That's not quite the right word. It came apart under a controlled impact, a single force applied to a specific point, and the man who came through it was already on his feet before the guests at the poker table had finished flinching. Dante Seo straightened his jacket, briefly, the way a person brushes off a minor inconvenience, and looked at the room. 6 men at the table. DeSalvo at the door. Holloway at the head position, closest to the window, with the particular expression of a man whose brain is receiving information faster than his face can process it. Dante looked at Holloway. Only at Holloway. The other 5 guests registered in his peripheral awareness as non-factors and were filed accordingly. "Gentlemen," Dante said, which was not an address to the guests, and everyone in the room understood that. DeSalvo moved. He was fast, genuinely fast for his size, and he knew what he was doing. He covered the distance from the door with real commitment, hand coming off his hip with the weapon already clearing leather. He got 3 steps. Dante didn't seem to move at all, but the way of it was that he moved once, precisely. And DeSalvo's weapon was in Dante's hand, and DeSalvo was on the floor with his arm bent at an angle arms were not designed to achieve, making a sound that immediately evacuated the remaining guests from the room in a disorganized rush toward any available exit. Dante looked at the weapon in his hand. He put it on the poker table, between the chips and a half-empty glass of scotch. "Just us," he said to Holloway. Holloway had not moved, which told Dante a great deal about him. Not courage, not calm, but the specific paralysis of a man whose money had always been the thing that moved between him and the consequences of his actions, and who had just encountered a situation where that buffer had been surgically removed. "I don't know who you are," Holloway said. His voice was doing the thing that voices do when a person is overriding the body's distress signals through sheer force of social conditioning. It was almost steady. "You don't need to," Dante said. "You need to tell me what you did to the woman in your pantry." A pause. Something shifted in Holloway's face. Microscale, nearly invisible, but Dante was very good at reading faces. What he saw was not guilt. It was recalibration. Holloway was categorizing the situation, assessing, deciding which version of this conversation would cost him the least. "She broke something valuable," Holloway said. "I addressed it. That's a household matter, and it's—" "Stop." Holloway stopped. "Say the next sentence very carefully," Dante said. "I want to make sure I understand exactly what you think justifies what I saw in that room before I came up here." Another pause. Holloway's jaw moved slightly. A guest had left a glass of water at the end of the table, and Holloway looked at it the way a man in a desert looks at a mirage. "I'll compensate her," Holloway said. "Whatever she needs. Medical, lost wages, I can write a check tonight." Dante pulled out a chair and sat down on the opposite side of the poker table from Holloway. He picked up one of the poker chips and turned it over in his fingers. He looked at it. "She was on that floor for over an hour," Dante said, "with broken ribs, in the dark, while you played cards." "It wasn't while you played cards." His voice didn't rise. It went flatter, quieter, which was worse. "She called me because she had no one else to call, and she almost didn't call because she'd spent so long in your house learning that asking for help costs more than it's worth. I don't know what she told you, but she didn't tell me anything." Dante set the chip down. "I could hear her breathing." Holloway seemed to run out of words. The room was very quiet except for the rain. DeSalvo was still on the floor. He hadn't tried to move, which was sensible. "So here's what's going to happen," Dante said. "And I want you to hear this clearly, because I'm only going to say it once, and what you understand about your situation right now will determine what tonight costs you." Holloway was sweating. The expensive shirt, the custom suit, he was sweating through all of it, and there was something ancient and specific about watching a man who had spent 61 years believing himself untouchable encounter the exact texture of what touch actually felt like. "My first question," Dante said, "is whether this is the first time." Holloway said nothing. "Second question," Dante said, "is whether you understand the difference between what you think I'm here to do and what I'm actually here to do." "What are you here to do?" Holloway's voice had gotten smaller. Not humble, smaller. "There's a difference. Humility implies understanding. This was just the reflexive compression of a man who has finally registered the actual weight of what's standing across from him." Dante stood up from the chair. He walked around the table, unhurried, and Holloway tracked him with his eyes, the way prey tracks a predator, that full-body attention that bypasses conscious thought entirely and operates somewhere older and more reliable. When Dante reached Holloway's side of the table, he stopped. He stood there for a moment, just standing, and Holloway made a sound in his chest that wasn't quite a word and wasn't quite anything else. "You had security," Dante said. "You had a gate and a wall and 6 men on your payroll. You had 40 years of being the biggest thing in every room you walked into. He looked at Holloway. None of it was enough. Holloway's hand was gripping the arm of his chair. His knuckles had gone white. She called me 17 minutes ago, Dante said. I was on the other side of the city. He leaned down slightly, not much, just enough to bring his face into Holloway's line of sight at a level that required Holloway to look up. Think about what that means, Dante said. Think very carefully about what that means for every day that comes after tonight. In the pantry, the house had gone silent. Zuri noticed it the way you notice a sound stopping. Not all at once, but in layers. First the voices from the poker room, which had been a constant background texture for the last hour, just evaporated. Then the movement sounds, footsteps, and the occasional door ceased. Then everything became the particular silence that large houses achieve when they're genuinely empty of human activity. She gripped the phone. No new text. She put her ear against the pantry door and listened. Nothing. Then, footsteps. Not the quick panicked steps of someone running, and not the slow measured steps of someone patrolling. Something else. Deliberate, getting closer. A sound at the door, metal on metal. Not the lock, something adjacent to the lock, working at it from the outside. Zuri pulled back from the door and pressed herself against the far shelving unit, which was an instinctive move and also completely pointless given the size of the pantry, and she gripped the phone hard enough that she could feel the cracked screen protector cutting slightly into her palm. The lock gave. The door opened. The man on the other side of it was not Dante. He was big, wide through the chest, with a face that suggested he'd had a complicated several minutes. He looked at her and held up one hand, palm out, a gesture of such specific non-threat that she recognized it as practiced, a deliberate communication in a language of controlled situations. My name's Rook, he said. I work for Dante. He's upstairs. He asked me to get you to the car. She looked at him. You're the one from the phone, she said. I heard the call, yeah. He glanced at her arm braced against her ribs. Can you walk? I said I could. Okay. He stepped back from the door, giving her maximum clearance. Take your time. She almost laughed at that. Take your time. She was on the floor of a pantry in a house that had apparently just been quietly dismantled by a small army, with fractured ribs and a borrowed coat waiting for her somewhere outside, and the man in the doorway was telling her to take her time. She stood up. It cost her more than she wanted to show. She kept her face neutral through the worst of it, and by the time she was fully upright, she had her breathing under control, more or less, and she met Rook's eyes without looking away. Let's go, she said. He nodded once and led her through the kitchen. She passed the spot where the decanter had broken without looking at it. She passed the door to the study hallway without looking down it. She kept her eyes on Rook's back and her hand against her ribs, and she moved, one step and then another, and she did not look back. Outside, the rain had not stopped, but it had thinned to something less aggressive. Still present, still cold, but no longer performing. One of the black SUVs was pulled up to the service entrance with its rear door open and its engine running. A man she didn't know held an umbrella over the door in a gesture that was both professional and, in the context of the last hour, so surreal it nearly broke her composure. She got into the car. She sat in the dark interior, in the smell of leather, and something else, clean, neutral, expensive. And she looked at her own hands in her lap. They were steady. She was a little surprised by that. Rook got in on the other side and pulled the door shut. Where are we going? She said. Clinic, off the docks. It's private. Private meaning illegal. Private meaning no questions and no paperwork. He looked at her. Unless you want questions and paperwork. She thought about the questions. She thought about what paperwork would mean. She thought about the hospital forms and the police forms and the insurance forms and all the institutional machinery that turned a woman's worst night into a case number in a mandatory reporter situation and a conversation with officers who would look at the Holloway name on the incident report and start making calculations she wouldn't be part of. No, she said. No paperwork. He nodded, looked out the window. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He's still in there, she said. Yes. With Holloway. Yes. She looked at the house through the rain-blurred window. The lights in the study were still on. She could see nothing else. No movement, no silhouettes, just lit windows in a large, dark house that had gone very quiet. Is he going to... She stopped. Rook waited. Is he going to kill him? she said. Not a question, exactly. More like a thing she was saying out loud for the first time to see how it sat. Rook didn't answer immediately, and his not answering immediately was itself an answer of a kind. He's going to make a decision, Rook said finally. He always makes a decision. She looked at her hands again. She thought, this is the part where your life changes. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way things actually change. At the exact moment when you stop being someone things happen to and start being someone whose choices have consequences. She had called that number. She had pressed that single button. That was a choice. Everything after it was a consequence. She thought about what that meant. She thought about what she had put in motion. She thought about the poker guests who had scattered like paper in a sudden wind, about the locked pantry door giving way, about the sound of Holloway's house, which had been a place of power for 61 years, going completely, totally, irretrievably silent. She pressed her hand against her ribs and breathed and said nothing and waited. And the rain continued to thin against the windows, and the lit windows of the house continued to glow, and somewhere inside that light, on the other side of a decision being made by a man she barely knew, everything that had existed before tonight was becoming something that could never go back to what it was. The engine idled. The umbrella man had disappeared. Rook was looking at his phone, and then, through the rain, she heard something from inside the house, muffled, indistinct, but unmistakable in its human register. The sound of a man who had just understood, too late, exactly what kind of night this was going to be. The pantry door was open behind her. The lock was broken. There was no going back through it. The sound didn't come again. Zuri sat with it, that muffled human register from inside the house, shapeless and final. And then the house went quiet again and stayed quiet, and she stopped waiting for another sound and started waiting for something else, though she couldn't have named exactly what. Rook was still looking at his phone. His face gave away nothing. She had the impression that his face had been specifically trained to give away nothing, that it was a professional skill he'd developed over years of sitting in cars outside houses where things were happening that he was not going to describe to anyone. She looked at the clock on the dashboard. 9:58. Less than an hour ago, she'd been filling glasses in a room full of men who didn't know her name. She pressed her hand against her ribs and looked out the window and thought about nothing, deliberately. The way you think about nothing when thinking about something would break you open in a place you can't afford to be broken. 11 minutes later, the service entrance opened and Dante came through it. He walked to the car without hurrying. His jacket was on, both hands visible. She looked for blood and found it on his right shirt cuff, a small amount, partially concealed by the jacket sleeve. His face was the same face she'd seen in her kitchen 3 weeks ago. Calibrated, reading the environment, settling on her, and staying there. He opened the rear door on his side and got in. The car moved before he'd fully closed the door. He looked at her. Not the way men usually looked at her, which was either through her or at the parts of her they found relevant. He looked at her face, and then at her arm braced against her ribs, and something passed through his expression that wasn't pity and wasn't satisfaction and wasn't the particular self-congratulation of a man who has just done something he wants credit for. "The clinic is 12 minutes, he said. "What did you do to him?" she said. A pause. Not evasion, consideration. He was deciding how much truth this moment required. "I made sure he understood the situation," Dante said. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She looked at him. He looked back. The rain tapped against the windows and the city moved past them, and neither of them looked away. "Is he alive?" she said. "Yes." "Is he going to stay that way?" Another pause. Shorter this time. "That depends on him." She nodded once and looked forward. She didn't have the energy to press further, and on some level she understood that pressing further would get her to information she wasn't ready to be responsible for. There was a specific kind of not knowing that was a gift, and she was old enough to recognize it. They rode in silence for 3 minutes. Then Dante said, "How long has it been going on?" Not a question. A statement with a question inside it. She kept her eyes forward. "What makes you think tonight was the first time?" He didn't answer that either. The clinic was not what she expected. She had built a picture from the word illegal, something improvised and dim, smelling of antiseptic and poor decisions. What she found instead was a space that occupied the entire basement floor of a converted warehouse 2 blocks from the southern docks, temperature-controlled, equipped with the kind of medical machinery that didn't belong anywhere this far off the books. A woman in her 50s named Dr. Park met them at the bottom of the stairs. looked at Zuri with the specific brisk assessment of someone who has made a career of treating people who cannot go to hospitals, and said, "Let's get some films." The x-ray confirmed 2 fractured ribs on the left side. The third rib had a hairline fracture that Dr. Park described as the one that could have been serious if you'd waited much longer. She cleaned the abrasion on Zuri's shoulder, wrapped her ribs with practiced efficiency, gave her something for the pain that she took without argument, and told her she needed 48 hours of minimal movement and 2 weeks of nothing that involved lifting, twisting, or breathing hard. Zuri sat on the examination table in the aftermath of all this and looked at the fluorescent light on the ceiling and felt the pain medication beginning to soften the edges of everything. Dante was outside. She'd heard him on the phone in the hallway twice. Brief calls, the kind where he did most of the listening. She hadn't tried to hear the content. When Dr. Park left to write up discharge instructions, Zuri sat alone in the examination room for a while and let herself feel everything she hadn't let herself feel for the past 2 hours. It didn't arrive as tears. It arrived as a kind of full-body exhaustion, so profound it felt structural, like the scaffolding holding her upright had just quietly decided it was done. Her hands were still in her lap, and they were still steady, which she found irritating, because steadiness in this moment felt like a lie her body was telling on her behalf. She thought about the pantry floor. She thought about the sound of the lock engaging on the other side of the door. She thought about the 22 minutes she'd lain there before she reached for the phone, and what she'd been telling herself during those 22 minutes, which was essentially, this is manageable, this is survivable, this is just another thing you get through and then don't talk about, and then put in the box with the other things you don't talk about. She thought about how many things were in that box. The door opened. Dante came in without knocking, which was either arrogance or the absence of any framework in which knocking applied, and he stood against the far wall with his arms at his sides and looked at her. "Park says 2 weeks, he said. I heard her. You need a place to stay. Your apartment is fine. It's a 4th-floor walk-up. Park said minimal movement. She looked at him. How do you know it's a 4th-floor walk-up? He held her gaze without flinching. I know where you live. Of course you do. She looked back at the wall. Because you left a phone on my kitchen table. Yes. Which means you were in my apartment. Yes. She breathed. The medication was doing its work, smoothing the worst of the physical pain into something manageable, but it didn't touch the thing she was feeling now, which wasn't pain exactly, but was adjacent to it. I want to know something, she said. Okay, and I want you to tell me the truth. Not the version that sounds reasonable. The actual truth. He waited. Why me? She said. You left that phone for me specifically. You came through my employer's service entrance and ended up in my kitchen, which means you knew who worked there and who didn't, so you knew I was there. Why me? A long pause. He moved from the wall and pulled a chair from the corner and sat in it, which surprised her. Not because it was strange, but because she'd half expected him to remain standing, which was where power positioned itself. The night I came through that door, he said, I had been betrayed. She waited. Someone I trusted told someone I shouldn't have trusted where I was going to be that night. The knife that found me. It found me because someone in my organization put a map in the right hands. He looked at his own hands for a moment, then back at her. I came through that service entrance because I needed 30 seconds to think without being on a street where people knew what I looked like. And when I came through that door and you were there, you thought about whether I was part of it, she said. For about 2 seconds, he said. Then I stopped. Because of the towel. Because of everything around the towel. The way you moved. The way you didn't react. You weren't afraid of me in the way people are afraid of me when they know what I am. And you weren't not afraid in the way people perform, not being afraid when they're trying to get something. He paused. You were just present. Like I was just a person in your kitchen who needed something simple. She looked at him. That's a lot of trust to place in a towel, she said. I've built trust on less. She thought about that. She thought about the box of things she didn't talk about, and about the 22 minutes on the pantry floor, and about the lease in February and her sister in Baltimore she hadn't called. Okay, she said finally. Okay, what? Okay, I believe you. She looked at the wall again. It doesn't solve the problem. What problem? The problem, she said, that I pressed that button, that I called you, that you came and you walked into that man's house and did whatever you did to him. She turned back to face him. He has lawyers, Dante. He has connections. He has 40 years of being a man that things don't stick to. And now you've... She gestured, a small pained motion that her ribs immediately penalized her for. Whatever you did tonight, it doesn't stay in that house. You understand that, right? That it's going to come out. And when it comes out, let me worry about what comes out. I can't let you worry about it because it's my name on the employment record. I'm the one who was in that house. I'm the only person with a documented reason to want that man hurt. She looked at him steadily. If something happens to him, I'm the one they're going to look at first. A silence. Dante looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet. Not surprise exactly. More like the recognition of a specific kind of intelligence he'd been told was there, but was now seen in operation. You're right, he said. She hadn't expected that. The directness of it. Most men, when presented with a problem their actions had created, argued with the problem's existence before acknowledging it. He had simply agreed. I know I'm right, she said. So what do we do about it? That was the question that was sitting between them, unresolved, when Rook knocked once and opened the examination room door. His face had changed. She noticed it immediately. The professional neutrality had cracked slightly at the edges, which on a face as controlled as his registered like a shout. We have a problem, Rook said. Dante looked at him. Holloway made a call, Rook said, before you got upstairs. Before we had the phones. A beat. Who did he call? Dante said. His voice had gone to a place she hadn't heard it go yet. Past flat, past quiet. Into something that had no temperature at all. Rook looked at him, and the look he gave him was the look of a man delivering information that has personal consequences for the person receiving it. Marcus Webb, Rook said. The silence that followed lasted 4 full seconds. Zuri looked at Dante. Whatever the name meant, it had done something to the air in the room. Not to his face was still, but to the air around him, the quality of the space he occupied, like a barometric drop before a major weather system. Who's Marcus Webb? She said. Neither man answered her immediately, and the fact that they didn't answer immediately told her more than any answer would have. He's the city commissioner for organized crime enforcement, Dante said, and his voice was flat in the way that flat things are sometimes the most dangerous things. He also runs the East Side Allocation Committee, the Port Authority Contracts Board, and 3 shell entities that process about 30% of East Harbor Syndicate revenue. She looked at him. He works for you. He works with me, Dante said. There's the difference. One I have apparently been operating under a significant misapprehension about. Rook said, Webb called Holloway 3 minutes after the syndicate board meeting last Tuesday, the one where Dante laid out the Sable Harbor acquisition. Zuri watched Dante absorb this. There was no outward visible absorption, no change in posture, no muscle movement in his face that she could detect. But something was happening behind his eyes that was very much absorption, the rapid structural reconfiguration of a person who has just discovered that the ground they've been standing on is a different shape than they thought. He knew I was coming tonight, Dante said. Not a question. He knew within 20 minutes of you leaving the meeting, Rook said. We think the call Holloway made before we got the phones. Webb was prepped for it. He had a response ready. What kind of response? Rook looked at him steadily. The federal kind. Another silence. Longer this time. Zuri understood with sudden clarity exactly what she was sitting in the middle of. Not a rescue. Not a clean extraction of one woman from one bad situation. She was sitting at the collapse point of something much larger, a structure that had taken years to build, honeycombed with betrayal. She was only now glimpsing the scale of, and Dante's arrival at that house tonight had not been the offensive action it had appeared to be. It had been the trigger. They knew you'd come, she said. Holloway knew, because Webb knew. And Webb knew because someone at that Tuesday meeting told Webb what I'd decided to do about Holloway, Dante said, which means someone in the room told him. Which means the leak isn't Webb, she said. Dante looked at her. Webb is just the mechanism, she said. The leak is whoever talked to Webb, whoever was in that meeting and made the call. The silence that followed this was different from all the preceding silences. It had the quality of a room where everyone has stopped pretending not to know something. Rook was looking at the floor. Dante said, very quietly, Who was in the room, Rook? Rook looked up. His face had gone back to professional neutral, but the effort of it was visible now in a way it hadn't been earlier. 12 people, Rook said. Board members. And Jin Ho. The name landed like a dropped piece of metal. Zuri looked at the door. The closed door. The room beyond it where Jinho was presumably sitting with the cars, waiting, having driven Dante across the city in 17 minutes because he knew the route, because he knew the house, because he had known where they were going before Dante had even finished saying the address. She thought Jinho, who was already moving when Dante ended the call. She thought Jinho, who adjusted the wheel before Dante said the destination. She looked at Dante. His face was doing something she didn't have a word for. It wasn't grief, and it wasn't rage, and it wasn't the cold, clinical analysis she'd seen him operate with all night. It was the specific expression of a person confronting the exact wound that leaves the most permanent scar. Not the surprise of being betrayed, but the knowledge of having been betrayed by the one person the wound could not have been inflicted without. "How long have you known him?" she said softly. Not pushing, just present. 14 years, Dante said. The number sat in the room. Rook's phone buzzed. He looked at it and something moved across his face. "Webb's people are at the Holloway estate," he said. "Not police. His people." He looked at Dante. "They're not there for Holloway." "No," Dante said. "They're not. We have maybe 20 minutes before they trace the clinic." Zuri looked at Dante. He was looking at the middle distance, at nothing, doing the rapid interior calculation of a man whose operational landscape has just been completely restructured against him. His route across the city tonight, Jinho would have relayed it. His location now. Jinho knew the clinic, had driven there before on Dante's instructions, had known the address before the destination was spoken. 20 minutes. She thought, I pressed a button and I destroyed this man's life. She pushed that thought away because it wasn't useful, and because it wasn't entirely true, and because the medication was doing enough to her thinking without guilt adding to it. "What do we do?" she said. "We move," Rook said. "Where?" "Not here." "That's not an answer." "Zuri." Dante's voice, quiet, cut through the room without rising. She looked at him. He was looking at her now, back from wherever the middle distance had taken him, and his eyes had the particular quality she'd seen that first night in the kitchen, calculating threat levels, settling on her, deciding. "I'm going to ask you something," he said. "Okay. And you don't have to say yes. Ask." "I need 48 hours," he said, "to find out who talked, to close the Webb situation, to make sure that when the dust settles, your name doesn't appear anywhere in what comes next." He paused. "But I need you somewhere I can verify is safe, which means somewhere Jinho doesn't know, which means I have a very short list and none of them are comfortable." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her apartment, 4th floor, walk-up, lease in February. She thought about what happens to a woman whose name appears in the investigation of a billionaire who has just been visited by organized crime in a city where the Organized Crime Enforcement Commissioner is himself organized crime. She thought about visibility, about spending years making yourself small, becoming the person no one looks at twice, the maid in the room that the room agrees not to see. She thought about the pantry floor and the locked door and the 22 minutes and the phone in her pocket. She thought, the thing about making yourself invisible is that it doesn't protect you. It just means no one sees you getting hurt. "Yes," she said. "You didn't hear the question yet. The question was whether I trust you enough to let you make a decision about my safety," she said. "The answer is yes. For 48 hours. Something moved through his face. Quick, gone. "Okay," he said. He stood up. He looked at Rook. The look lasted half a second and contained what must have been an entire operational conversation because Rook nodded once and left the room without another word. Dante looked at Zuri. "Can you walk?" he said. "You asked me that already tonight." The answer's gotten more relevant. She slid carefully off the examination table, one hand braced against it for the first 3 seconds, and then she was standing, and the pain was a managed thing, still there, present and insistent, but underneath the medication's ceiling. She breathed once, checked the ceiling, breathed again. "Yes," she said. "I can walk." "There's a car in the back. Different car. Not one of ours. Registered clean. A man named Costa is driving it. He doesn't work for the syndicate, he doesn't know Webb, and he's been driving for me personally for 6 years before Jinho." Before Jinho. She heard the weight in that. "Okay. Where we're going is about 40 minutes out of the city, a property. It's not on any record connected to me." "Okay," she said again. He looked at her for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said. She frowned. For what? For the 48 hours. For the fact that you called for a ride and instead got... He didn't finish the sentence, just gestured once, a small motion that encompassed the examination room and the clinic and the city outside and all of it. She looked at him. She thought about what to say. She thought about the pantry floor and the locked door and the 17 minutes and the way he'd come through that window without announcing himself or explaining himself or asking for anything for coming, she said. He held her eyes for a moment. Then he opened the door and said, "Stay close." And she followed him into the corridor and toward the back of the clinic. And behind them, the examination room with its fluorescent light and its paper-covered table sat empty, and the question of what it meant to be visible, truly visible, to one person, at the exact moment the world had decided you weren't worth seeing, moved with her down the hallway and out into the night. Outside, the rain had almost stopped. The car idled at the back of the building, a dark sedan she didn't recognize, driven by a man she'd never seen who looked at her in the rearview mirror once and then looked at the road. Dante got in beside her. Rook got in the front. The door closed. They pulled out of the alley behind the clinic, turned north, and began moving away from the docks, away from the Holloway estate, away from the radio silence where a man named Jin Ho was now presumably understanding that the 20-minute window had been noticed, that the clock had started, that the calculation he'd been running for 14 years had just reached its final operation. Zuri watched the city go by. She thought about how completely, in the space of 2 hours, the architecture of her life had been disassembled. Not by force, not by anyone's deliberate intention, but by the simple act of pressing a single button on a phone she'd carried in her pocket for 3 weeks without quite knowing why. She thought about consequence, about the specific irreversibility of action, about how you could spend years maintaining perfect stillness, making no large moves, disturbing nothing. And then one night a man locks a door and something in you decides that stillness is no longer an option. And the first move you make after years of making none changes everything. And there is no direction after that except forward into whatever the next hour contains. The city thinned. The buildings got lower. The harbor lights fell behind them. And then Rook's phone rang, and he answered it and listened for 11 seconds without speaking. And then he lowered the phone and turned in his seat and looked at Dante with an expression that meant the 20 minutes they'd thought they had was a number that had just been revised significantly downward, because somewhere behind them, moving fast through the thinning rain, something that had been set in motion long before tonight had just caught up with the speed at which they were trying to outrun it. Rook said, "They have Jin Ho." 3 words. He delivered them the way you deliver information that has already become irreversible. Flat, no cushioning, because cushioning wastes time that the situation no longer has. Dante didn't respond immediately. The sedan moved through the thinning city, Costa's hands steady on the wheel, the road ahead empty and wet and reflecting the last of the streetlights before the urban grid gave way to the industrial fringe north of the harbor. "Alive?" Dante said. "For now." Rook lowered the phone to his lap. "Webb's people picked him up outside the clinic 14 minutes ago. They're not at a station. They're at the Meridian building, Webb's private floor." Zuri looked at Dante. His jaw was set. Nothing else had moved. "Why are they telling us?" Dante said. "Because they want a meeting." "When?" "Now. Tonight." Rook turned in the seat to face him fully. "Webb is asking for you directly, not through a proxy. You, in person, at the Meridian, within the hour." The car moved. The heater ran. Outside, the rain had reduced to a fine mist that the headlights caught and scattered. "It's a trap," Zuri said. Both men looked at her. "I know," Dante said. "Then why are we still talking about it like it's a decision?" "Because Jinho is 14 years," Dante said. "And whatever he did, that's still 14 years." She looked at him. She understood it. She didn't agree with it, but she understood it. The specific weight of a long loyalty even after it is broken. The way it doesn't stop mattering just because it has stopped meaning what you thought it meant. "If you go in there," she started. "I know." "Dante." "I know." His voice was quiet and final, not dismissing her, just already past the argument, already at the decision, and the decision had been made in the 3 seconds after Rook said they have Jinho, in the specific part of Dante's CO that operated below the threshold of calculation. He looked at Rook. "Get her somewhere clean," he said. "Costa knows that—" "No," Zuri said. He looked at her. "No," she said again. "You don't get to do that. You don't get to ship me somewhere and walk into that building alone." "This isn't your— I'm the reason you went to that house tonight," she said. I pressed the button. This is exactly my situation. And if you walk in there alone with Webb holding Jinho as the lever, you have no one to watch what Webb does with his hands while he's talking to your face. Rook said quietly. She's not wrong. Dante looked at Rook with an expression that suggested he had opinions about that contribution. I'm not a liability, Zuri said. I'm someone Webb doesn't know exists. He knows about the clinic because Jinho told him, but Jinho didn't know I was in that car. He was already gone when Costa picked us up. Webb knows you have a woman. He doesn't know who she is or what she looks like or what she heard tonight. She watched Dante process this. She watched him do the things she'd seen him do twice now. The rapid structural reorganization of a plan around new variables, the way a hand closes around a different tool when the first one breaks. That's either very useful, he said, or very dangerous. Yes, she said. Welcome to the last 4 hours of my life. Something almost happened in his face. Almost. You stay behind me, he said. You say nothing unless I tell you. You read the room and you tell me afterward what you saw. That's it. Okay? Zuri. I said okay. He held her eyes for another second. Then he looked at Costa. Meridian Building, North Entrance. Costa adjusted the mirror, changed lanes, and the sedan began moving in a direction that everything reasonable in the situation argued against, toward the tallest building on the north waterfront, with its lit windows reflecting off the harbor like a second city suspended above the first. The Meridian was 52 floors of glass and structural steel that had been built on a city development contract in the mid-90s, which meant it had been built in part with money that moved through the same shell entities that currently processed 30% of East Harbor syndicate revenue. Marcus Webb had occupied the 48th floor for 11 years. His official title was City Commissioner for Organized Crime Enforcement. The specific irony of this had apparently never become visible to anyone with the authority to do anything about it, which was less a failure of intelligence than a deliberate structural feature of the city's upper economy. The north lobby was empty at this hour, except for a single security guard who saw them coming and made no move to stop them, which confirmed what Dante had already understood. They were expected, the building had been prepped, and whatever happened in the next hour had been arranged in advance by someone with full access to the sequence of events that had led them here. The elevator opened when Rook pressed 48. No key required. Zuri stood in the elevator and breathed carefully, ribs held, and looked at the floor indicator climbing through numbers and thought about what she was doing. She was in an elevator going to the floor of a corrupt city official who was holding a man hostage to leverage the organized crime boss standing beside her, whose shirt cuff was still stained with the blood of a billionaire who had fractured her ribs 3 hours ago. And she was here because she had pressed a button on a phone a stranger left on her kitchen table. She had made herself invisible for years. She was currently about as visible as a person could get. The elevator opened. Marcus Webb was 63 years old and looked like what he was. A man who had spent 4 decades in rooms where power was distributed and had learned to position himself at the distribution point rather than the receiving end. He was medium height, thickening through the middle, in the specific way of men whose physical confidence had long since relocated from their bodies to their bank accounts, with silver hair worn short and the particular ease of posture that belongs to people who have not been surprised in a very long time. He was surprised now. He recovered from it in under 2 seconds, which was fast, but Zuri had been watching for it and she caught it. The microcontraction around his eyes when they entered, and Webb registered that there were 3 of them instead of 2, and that one of the 3 was a woman he had no file on. The room was large, an executive floor conference space, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the harbor. Rain still moved across the glass in shifting patterns. The city below looked small and organized from up here, which she suspected was the point of having the meeting in this particular room. 4 of Webb's people were positioned at the corners. Not police, private contractors, the kind of men who moved through situations like this one, the same way Rook moved through them, which meant she was looking at a room that had already done the threat math and arranged itself accordingly. Jinho was seated at the far end of the conference table. He was upright, hands visible on the table in front of him, and he didn't appear physically harmed. Not yet. But there was a quality to his stillness that wasn't composure. It was the stillness of a man who understood exactly what he had set in motion and was now sitting inside its consequences. He looked at Dante when they entered. Dante looked at him. The look lasted 3 seconds and contained everything that 14 years could compress into a single point of eye contact. The accumulated weight of shared history encountering the exact moment it became history, past tense, irreversible. Zuri watched Dante absorb it without expression, and she thought, that is what controlled grief looks like on a man who has never allowed himself a public version of it. Dante, Webb said, with the warmth of a man greeting a business associate at a quarterly meeting. Sit down. I'll stand, Dante said. Suit yourself. Webb looked at Zuri with a specific kind of looking, the administrative cataloging of an unknown variable. And you are. With me, Dante said. I can see that. Webb held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, decided something, and redirected to Dante. Long night. Get to it, Dante said. Webb picked up a glass of water from the table and drank from it, unhurried, and set it down. The performance of calm. She'd seen Holloway do a version of the same thing, the deliberate physical ease of a man demonstrating that the room was not affecting him. But where Holloway's version had been brittle underneath, Webb's was something different. Webb was actually calm. That was more frightening. The Sable Harbor acquisition, Webb said. That's what this is about. You know that. Tell me what I know, Dante said. Sable Harbor clears $140 million per cycle. You've been moving toward it for 2 years. Taking it means cutting out 3 independent operators who currently run buffer services for 6 city officials, including 2 federal liaisons. Webb paused. Including me. I know what Sable Harbor means. Then you know that moving on it the way you announced in Tuesday's meeting, direct acquisition, full consolidation, no buffer period, doesn't just cut revenue. It removes protection layers that certain people have spent years installing. Webb's voice remained even. Reasonable. The tone of a man explaining something that should have been self-evident. You destabilized a very careful arrangement. The arrangement was costing me 40% overhead for services I could run internally. The arrangement was keeping you legal, Webb said, and the word landed with enough weight to shift the air in the room. We're close enough to legal that the distinction stopped mattering. The work I do for you, the work I've done for the syndicate for 11 years. It's not bookkeeping, Dante. It's architecture. You don't tear out load-bearing walls because you've decided you want more floor space. Dante looked at him steadily. You tipped Holloway. I warned Holloway that an associate of mine was upset with him and might respond in a way that created legal exposure. Yes. You set up a federal response to my location tonight. I notified the appropriate parties that a situation might require their attention. Yes. Webb spread his hands on the table, a gesture of openness that was entirely theatrical. I am the city commissioner for organized crime enforcement, Dante. Occasionally I have to do something that resembles the job. While running 30% of the syndicate's revenue through your shell entities, while maintaining a relationship that has benefited both parties enormously for over a decade. Webb leaned forward slightly, which is why we're talking instead of you being in a federal holding facility right now, which is where you would be if I'd wanted that. I didn't want that. I want this conversation, this negotiation, this reasonable discussion between 2 men who have a mutually beneficial arrangement that has hit a rough patch. Rook was standing slightly to Dante's left. Zuri was slightly to his right, back enough to be out of the primary line of sight, close enough to hear everything. She was watching Webb's hands, his contractor's positions, the door, Jinho at the far end of the table. Jinho was watching her. She noticed it suddenly. He had been watching her, not the conversation, with an expression that wasn't readable in any straightforward way. Not guilt, not anger. Something more complicated, more personal. She looked back at Webb. What do you want? Dante said. I want the Sable Harbor acquisition restructured, Webb said. Not abandoned, restructured. You take the asset, you keep the operators in place as nominal managers, you maintain the buffer layer, and you bring me in as a silent partner at 15% of net. A pause. 15, Dante said. I've earned it. You've earned the arrangement we had. You haven't earned restructuring. I've earned, Webb said, and his voice dropped half a register. The fact that you're standing in this room instead of explaining yourself to a federal grand jury. Tonight. That's what I've earned tonight. He looked at Dante. The question is whether you understand what I'm giving you by having this conversation instead of making 3 phone calls. Zuri watched Dante. His breathing was level. His hands were at his sides. Every instinct she'd developed in the last 4 hours for reading him told her he was calculating something. Not the negotiation. Webb's terms were almost secondary. He was calculating the room, the positions, the variables. She looked at Jinho again. Jinho was still watching her. And then she understood something. She understood it the way you understand things that arrive below the threshold of conscious thought. Not as a conclusion reached through reasoning, but as a recognition of a pattern you've been looking at without naming. She looked at Jinho's hands on the table. She looked at the contractor in the near left corner. She looked at the space between them. Jinho wasn't being held. His hands were on the table in front of him, visible, untied. No one was physically restraining him. The contractors were positioned at the room's perimeter, watching the door and the windows, not watching Jinho. He was sitting at the far end of the table with a glass of water in front of him that someone had placed there at some point, because you don't give hostages water glasses. You give hostages zip ties. They have Jinho. That was what the call had said. But they hadn't taken Jinho. Jinho had come here. She felt the understanding rearrange something fundamental in the structure of the room. Dante, she said, quietly. Just his name. He looked at her. She moved her eyes toward Jinho without moving her head. A small motion, 2 degrees. Dante looked at Jinho. Jinho looked back, and something shifted in Dante's face. The subtlest possible shift, a micro-movement at the jaw, and then it was gone. And he looked back at Webb, and when he spoke his voice had changed in a way that wouldn't be detectable to anyone who hadn't been listening to it for the last 4 hours. 15%, he said. Net, quarterly. Webb relaxed visibly. The particular loosening of a man whose bet has just paid. Quarterly is acceptable. I want the federal response to tonight dissolved. Tonight. Any paperwork, any notifications, anything that went out. I want confirmation it's been recalled before I leave this building. Reasonable. And I want Jinho released. Webb glanced at Jinho. He's free to go when... Now, Dante said. He comes to my side of the room now, or this conversation ends, and we find out together which version of tonight is worse. Webb looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded, once, toward the far end of the table. Jinho stood up. He walked the length of the conference table and came to stand near Dante, and as he passed Zuri, their eyes met for half a second, and she saw it then. The specific anguish of a man who has done a thing he cannot undo, and who has not yet decided whether he is ashamed of it. She held his gaze for that half second and gave him nothing. Then she looked back at Webb. Documentation, Dante said. The restructuring terms in writing, signed with your personal seal, not a proxy. You. You want paper on this? I want insurance, Dante said. Same as you. Webb studied him. You'll have it by morning. Tonight. A pause. Webb looked at the contractor near the window, who moved to a laptop on the side credenza and opened it. Webb looked back at Dante. Give me 40 minutes, Webb said. 20, Dante said. I have somewhere to be. What? They waited in a side room. Dante, Rook, Zuri, Jinho, while Webb's assistant drafted the restructuring agreement in the main conference space. One of Webb's contractors stood outside the side room door. Not blocking it, just present, which was its own kind of message. The room was small, used for storage of some kind, with 3 folding chairs and a filing cabinet and a window that looked at the building's internal atrium. Zuri sat in one of the chairs with her hand against her ribs. The medication was wearing off at the edges. She could feel the fractures again, not the drowning pain of earlier, but the insistent localized reminder of structural damage. Jinho stood at the window with his back to the room. Dante stood near the door. Rook stood between them in the way that a person stands when they are monitoring 2 separate situations simultaneously. The silence lasted approximately 90 seconds before Jinho said, without turning from the window, I didn't know about tonight. Don't, Dante said. I need you to know. Jinho. His voice cut it off. Not loud, just definitive. Don't tell me what you need right now. Jinho turned from the window. His face was doing the thing that faces do when a person has had several hours to sit with what they've done and have arrived at the stage of needing the other person to understand the why of it, because the why feels like the last piece of dignity available. Webb approached me 8 months ago, Jinho said. He had documentation, things I'd done, not for the syndicate, personal things, things from before. He stopped. My sister's family is in Seoul. There are people there who could be... Stop, Dante said. I need you to understand that I wasn't... I understand, Dante said. That doesn't change what it is. The silence after that was the worst kind, the silence of a thing that has been fully said and fully understood and cannot be moved by any amount of additional language. Zuri watched Jinho's face cycle through three things in quick succession. She was good at reading faces. 3 years of reading Holloway's face had made her very good. And what she saw in Jinho's face was, in order, the relief of having said the thing, the collapse of having it received exactly as the thing it was, rather than something smaller, and then the particular grief of a man who has finally, at the end of a long road of small betrayals, arrived at the full cost of them. She looked at Dante. His face was closed. Not cold. Closed. The way a wound closes over. The way the body's first response to damage is to contain it. "When we're out of this building," Dante said, and his voice was level with immense invisible effort, "we'll have the rest of this conversation." Jinho nodded. No one spoke again. Rook's phone buzzed. He looked at it. "Webb's ready?" They filed back into the conference room. Webb had the document on the table, 2 pages, single-spaced, with the commissioner's seal at the bottom and a line for signatures. His own signature was already on it, which meant he'd signed it while they were in the side room, which meant he'd had it drafted before tonight's meeting, which meant none of this had been improvised. Dante picked up the document and read it. All of it, top to bottom, without rushing. Webb waited with the patience of a man who has waded through enough of these to know that rushing them costs more than waiting does. Dante read the second page and stopped. He read something a second time. He set the document down on the table. "Paragraph 7, he said. Webb looked at him. "Read me paragraph 7, Dante said. Webb picked up his copy and found paragraph 7 and read, "In the event of operational disruption, dissolution, or transfer of controlling interest in the East Harbor Syndicate, the terms of this agreement transfer automatically to the successor entity or designated operational heir, maintaining all percentage arrangements and protections herein described." Dante looked at him. "That's a standard continuity clause," Webb said. "That's a clause that says if I'm removed, voluntarily or otherwise, the arrangement doesn't end. It transfers. Which means whoever comes after me inherits you as a partner." "It's insurance," Webb said, "for both parties." "It's a mechanism," Dante said, "for making yourself unremovable from syndicate operations regardless of what happens to me personally." He looked at Webb. "Take it out." "Dante, take it out or we're done here." Webb looked at him for a long moment. The contractors at the perimeter hadn't moved. Rook hadn't moved. Jinho was standing very still near the door. "It'll take another 20 minutes to redraft," Webb said. "Then it takes 20 minutes. Webb looked at Dante. Something was happening behind Webb's eyes that wasn't calculation exactly. It was the recognition of a line, of a man who has identified the specific location of his own limit and is standing on it without any indication of moving. Webb had spent 40 years learning how to read that quality in men and to respond to it appropriately, because the alternative was the kind of escalation that made everyone's night significantly worse. He looked at his assistant. "Redraft paragraph 7. Remove the continuity clause. Standard dissolution language." The assistant began typing. Zuri exhaled slowly. Her ribs seized slightly at the expansion, and she managed not to make a sound. She pressed her hand against her side and looked at Webb's face while his attention was on his assistant, and she saw something she hadn't expected to see. Not relief, not frustration, but a quick and specific recalculation. The look of a man who has just decided that the concession he's made is acceptable because something larger is still in place. She didn't know what that something was. She filed it. The document was redrafted and printed in 18 minutes. Dante signed it, Webb signed it, copies were exchanged. The whole transaction had the mundane quality of a routine business closing, which was the most disorienting thing about it. That the worst of what had happened tonight could fold itself into paper and signatures and be called resolved. "The federal response," Dante said. Webb picked up his phone and made a call, 3 sentences, and ended it. "Done," he said. "I want confirmation." "You'll have it by the time you reach the lobby." Dante picked up his copy of the agreement and looked at Webb one more time. Not with hostility, with the specific quality of a man who is memorizing something. 11 years, Dante said. "Has been good for both of us," Webb said. "Yes," Dante said. "It has." He turned and walked toward the door. Rook followed. Jinho followed. Zuri fell into step, and as she passed Webb's position at the head of the table, she felt his attention on her again. That administrative cataloging, that variable assessment quality. And she kept her eyes forward and her face neutral, and she walked through the door and into the corridor and toward the elevator. The doors opened. They filed in. The doors closed. The elevator descended in silence. At floor 30, Rook's phone buzzed with a text. He showed it to Dante. Federal notification recalled. Whatever paperwork had gone out on tonight was being rerouted, reclassified, reassigned to a file that would sit in a cabinet in an office that would not be opened until someone with specific authority decided to open it, which would not happen while Webb needed the arrangement to continue. They stepped out into the lobby. Costa was already outside with the car, engine running. Dante stopped in the middle of the lobby. He turned to Jinho. Jinho stopped. They stood 4 feet apart in the empty lobby of the Meridian building at what was now past midnight, the harbor visible through the lobby glass behind them. The rain finally finished, the city wet and still. Dante said, "The Tuesday meeting. Who else knew you'd talk to Webb?" Jinho said, "No one, just me." 8 months. Yes. Everything you heard in 8 months. Jinho said nothing, which was the answer. Dante looked at him for a long time. His jaw moved once. His hands were at his sides. "You drive," Dante said. "Not for me. You drive Costa home, and then you take the car, and you take whatever you have at your apartment that you need, and you go somewhere I don't know about. Are we clear?" Jinho looked like he was going to say something. He stopped himself. "Are we clear?" Dante said again. "Yes," Jinho said, quiet. Broken in a specific and irreparable way. "Go." Jinho walked past him to the door. He pushed it open. He walked to the car and said something to Costa, and they exchanged positions, and Jinho got behind the wheel, and Costa stood on the curb. Dante watched the car pull away. Zuri stood beside him and watched it with him and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the moment didn't already contain. The car turned left at the corner and disappeared. Dante looked at the space where it had been. Then he looked at his copy of the agreement in his hand. He looked at it the way you look at a document you've signed that you already know is not the last word on the subject. That is, not like a resolution, but like the first move in a longer game, the one where the other player has just shown you which piece they think they can sacrifice to keep the board. She thought about paragraph 7, the continuity clause. Webb had given it up without enough of a fight. "What was in paragraph 7, she said. "The real version. What does it do?" Dante looked at her. "If I'm removed from the syndicate, if I die or I'm arrested or I'm forced out, Webb automatically becomes the operational authority over the arrangements. Overnight, without a vote, without a succession process." He paused. "The syndicate doesn't have a clear air structure. I've kept it that way deliberately. Webb knows that. A continuity clause in a signed agreement between us would have been the legal framework to make himself the default authority in a dissolution situation." She looked at him. "So he wasn't trying to renegotiate the Sable Harbor deal?" "No. I was trying to use Sable Harbor as the pretext to get you into a room to sign a document that had paragraph 7 in it." "Yes." "And when you made him remove it, he let me," Dante said. "Too easily." She looked at him. "He already has it somewhere else," she said. He looked at the harbor through the lobby glass. The water was still. The lights of the far shore made small broken reflections. "The Sable Harbor acquisition," he said slowly. "The Tuesday meeting. I announced the terms to 12 board members and Jinho. 12 people who would have understood immediately what full consolidation means for their own individual arrangements with the buffer operators." He paused. "Webb didn't need paragraph 7. Webb needed me to move on Sable Harbor in a way that created enough internal opposition that the board itself would initiate a removal process. He needed me to walk into that acquisition too aggressively, too visibly, in a way that gave the board legitimate grounds." She thought about this. "And tonight I walked into Holloway's house," he said, "on a personal matter, alone, without board approval or operational justification. I broke protocol and I left physical evidence and I drew federal attention to a syndicate-adjacent location, all in one night." He looked at her. "If Webb puts that in front of the board, they remove you," she said. "They remove me," he said, "voluntarily, by procedure. Which means the arrangement with Webb survives regardless of paragraph 7, because the board that replaces me was cultivated by Webb through the same buffer operators I was planning to cut out." The lobby was very quiet. Somewhere above them, on the 48th floor, Marcus Webb was sitting in his conference room with his signed copy of the restructuring agreement, and he was not thinking about Sable Harbor, and he was not thinking about the 15%, and he was looking at his harbor view with the specific satisfaction of a man who has just watched the clock start on a sequence that ends exactly where he planned for it to end. Dante's hand tightened on the agreement. One quiet motion. His knuckles went briefly white. Then his hand relaxed. He looked at Zuri. His face was stripped of its operational composure for exactly 2 seconds. Just a man, standing in a lobby at midnight, holding a document that had just taught him the full shape of how badly the evening had been designed against him. And in those 2 seconds, she saw everything he didn't usually let anyone see, and she didn't look away from it, and he didn't look away from her. Then it was gone. The composure returned, not like a mask being put back on, but like a person who has taken the full weight of something and decided they can carry it. I need to make a phone call, he said. Okay. And then we need to move tonight, before the board gets a version of tonight that comes from Webb's office instead of mine. How much time do you have? He looked at the harbor. Less than I thought, he said, and more than he thinks. He turned from the window and walked toward the lobby door, and Rook fell into step beside him, and Zuri moved with them into the open air of the waterfront, cold now, cleared of rain, smelling of salt and the particular clean of a city that has just been washed. And the lights of the Meridian building rose above them, floor after floor, and somewhere near the top a man sat in a room believing he had won the night, not knowing that the woman who had pressed a single button on a burner phone in a locked pantry 4 hours ago had just quietly read his face and filed the things she found there. And what she'd found in Marcus Webb's face, at the exact moment he agreed to remove paragraph 7, was not relief. It was patience. The patience of a man who is waiting for something he has already set in motion, something that does not require tonight's document, something already built and running in the dark behind everything that had happened in that room. And it was moving right now, at this hour, toward a point of arrival that Dante did not yet know about and that she was not yet certain she had correctly identified, but that she could feel the way you feel weather before it arrives, in the pressure of the air and the specific quality of the quiet. She walked beside him into the night and said nothing yet, because not yet was the right answer, because what she needed was one more piece, one more confirmation of the shape of what Webb was actually waiting for, and she thought she knew where to find it, and she thought it had been in the room with them the entire time, and she thought that when she told Dante what she believed she'd seen, the night that had already been the longest of her life was going to extend itself by several more hours before it found anything resembling an end. She told him in the car, not everything at once. She built it the way you build something that has to hold weight, from the base up, making sure each piece was set before she added the next one. Costa drove. Rook sat in the front and listened without turning around. The city moved past the windows in the specific way cities move at 12:30 in the morning, emptied of its daytime performance, showing its actual structure. Webb removed paragraph 7 too easily, she said. You already said that. Yes. Because he doesn't need it. Because whatever he's using to move the board against you, he already has it in place and it doesn't require your signature on anything. She looked at her hands in her lap. When he agreed to remove the clause, he looked patient, not relieved, patient, like a man who has already set something moving and is waiting for it to arrive. Dante was looking at her steadily. The board meeting, she said. Tuesday. 12 members and Jinho. Jinho told Webb about the Sable Harbor announcement within 20 minutes. But Jinho's been talking to Webb for 8 months, which means Webb didn't just know about Tuesday's meeting. He knew everything that happened in every meeting for 8 months. Yes, Dante said. So Webb knew you were moving toward Sable Harbor before Tuesday. He knew the direction you were heading. He had 8 months to prepare for it. She looked at him. He didn't prepare paragraph 7. That was the version he wanted you to find and reject and feel like you'd won something. What did he actually prepare? Silence. Rook turned in the front seat. The buffer operators, Rook said slowly. The 3 independents that the Sable Harbor acquisition cuts out. Zuri looked at him. Webb has relationships with all 3, Rook said, through the shell entities. If he told them 6 months ago that consolidation was coming, they'd want protection, Dante said. His voice had gone to the no-temperature place again. They'd want more than protection, Rook said. They'd want leverage. They'd want something that guaranteed their survival regardless of what Dante decided to do with Sable Harbor. What do they have? Dante said. Not to either of them specifically. To the car. To the night. Nobody answered immediately because nobody knew, and the not knowing was the specific texture of the thing that was moving toward them in the dark. Costa took a right onto the waterfront access road. The harbor appeared in the passenger window, wide and black and still, the far shore marked with industrial lights that made small orange paths across the water. Dante picked up his phone. He called a number and it answered on the second ring, which meant the person had been awake, which meant the person had been expecting a call or had been watching something unfold that made sleep unlikely. "Yoon," he said, "where are you?" Zuri listened to the half of the conversation she could hear and built the other half from context in Dante's face. Yoon was a board member. She understood that from the way Dante spoke to him, not with the authority he used with Rook, but with the specific register of a man speaking to an equal he trusts conditionally and is currently reevaluating. The call lasted 4 minutes. When Dante ended it, he sat for a moment with the phone in his hand. 3 board members have been contacted tonight, he said, while we were in the Meridian, while the meeting was running. Webb's people reached out to Lee, Park, and Cho with documentation, financial records, operational logs, a deposition from one of the buffer operators naming me as the direct authority over arrangements that are framed in the documents as criminal rather than operational. Framed by whom? Rook said. By whoever prepared the documents. Dante looked at the phone. Yoon says the records are detailed, specific, transaction level, the kind of documentation you don't compile in 8 months. You compile it over years, which means Webb started building this file before Jinho, before any of it. Zuri looked at him. How long? Yoon thinks at least 3 years. 3 years. She sat with that. 3 years ago, whatever Dante had been doing, Webb had already begun constructing the architecture of his removal. Every meeting, every transaction, every operational decision that passed through the syndicate's structure had been documented not as business, but as evidence, organized, annotated, prepared for exactly the use being made of it tonight. What does the board do with it? She said. They convene, Dante said. Emergency session. They review the documentation. They vote on whether to initiate a removal process. When? Yoon says Webb's people suggested tomorrow morning. But you know about it now, she said. Tonight, before they convene. Yes. So you have... She did the calculation. 7 hours. Maybe 8. Yes. What do you need? He looked at her. The question seemed to surprise him slightly. Not its existence, but its directness. The fact that it contained no subtext about her own situation, no implicit negotiation, just the straightforward logistical question of a person who has decided to be useful. I need the documentation Webb sent to be countered before the board convenes, he said. Which means I need documentation of my own. Specifically, I need Webb's financial relationship with the syndicate laid out in a form that makes the board understand that removing me doesn't end their exposure. It transfers it, wholesale, to a man who has been building a case against all of them for 3 years. Because if Webb did this to you, he has files on every board member, Dante said. That's how he operates. That's always been how he operates. I knew it in an abstract sense. I never let myself know it concretely. She thought about that. About the specific kind of not knowing that powerful men allow themselves because the alternative requires action they're not ready to take. Where are the financial records, she said. Webb's relationship with the syndicate. Who has them? Dante looked at her. Then he looked at Rook. Rook said, There's a woman named Sandra Lim. She manages the shell entity accounting. She's been with the syndicate 12 years, she's never been on Webb's payroll, and she has access to every transaction record going back to the beginning of the relationship. Does she know what night this is? Zuri said. She does now, Dante said, and picked up his phone again. Sandra Lim was 51 years old and had the specific energy of a person who has spent decades being the most competent individual in a series of rooms full of people who didn't want to acknowledge it. She arrived at a location Zuri was not told the address of in advance. A clean room above a dry cleaning business on the east side, nothing remarkable about it from the outside. Within 35 minutes of Dante's call, carrying a laptop and an expression of composed urgency that Zuri recognized immediately as a woman who had been waiting for this particular phone call for longer than tonight. She sat up at the room's single table, opened the laptop, and looked at Dante. The Meridian meeting, she said. Tell me exactly what documents Webb sent to Lee, Park, and Cho. Dante described them. Sandra typed while he talked, not transcribing, cross-referencing, pulling records on the laptop screen that Zuri couldn't read from her position against the wall. Rook stood near the door. The room was warm and smelled faintly of dry cleaning chemicals from the floor below. Zuri sat in the room's second chair and held her ribs and watched Sandra work and thought about the last time she'd been in a room where a woman was the most important person in it. She couldn't remember one. Sandra worked for 40 minutes without speaking except to ask Dante two clarifying questions, both of which he answered without hesitation. At the end of the 40 minutes, she turned the laptop around and showed him the screen. 11 years of transaction records, Sandra said. Every shell entity, every quarterly disbursement, every communication where Webb's name or seal appears as authorizing party, cross-referenced with his public salary and asset disclosures. She paused. The gap between what he's reported and what he's received from syndicate operations is approximately $4.3 million annually. Dante looked at the screen. For 11 years, he said. For 11 years, Sandra confirmed. Can you format it for a board presentation? Already doing it. Zuri looked at Dante. He was looking at the laptop screen with an expression she recognized now. The one that wasn't cold and wasn't grief. The one that was simply a man absorbing the full dimensions of something and deciding what to do with it. It won't be enough, she said. Everyone looked at her. The financial records prove Webb is compromised, she said. They don't prove he coordinated tonight. They don't prove the board outreach was him. A good lawyer argues he was a passive participant in the syndicate's arrangements, that the documentation he sent to Lee, Park, and Cho was a good faith compliance action. She paused. You need something that puts him in the driver's seat. Something that shows he designed tonight specifically. Sandra looked at Dante. Dante looked at Zuri. The call he made, Zuri said, when he reached out to Lee, Park, and Cho tonight, he made those calls from his personal phone while he was in the building with us. We were in the side room for 40 minutes. He was in the conference room. She looked at Dante. The Meridian has a communications log. Building security, outgoing calls from executive floors. It's a standard commercial building compliance requirement. If Webb made calls from a landline on 48 during our meeting, that log exists. Silence. Building compliance records are accessible through the city's Commercial Property Oversight Office, Sandra said slowly, which means they're accessible through the Commissioner's Office for Urban Development, Rook said, not Organized Crime Enforcement. Different department. Dante looked at Rook. Yoon sits on the Urban Development Advisory Committee, Rook said. Call him, Dante said. Well, the communications log from the Meridian's 48th floor for the period between 10:47 and 11:30 p.m. showed 4 outgoing calls from the executive conference room landline. 3 were to numbers registered to Lee Sung-jin, Park Dae-won, and Cho Min-soo, the 3 board members Webb had contacted with documentation. The 4th was to a number registered to a law firm on the 14th floor of the same building, which Dante identified in under 60 seconds as the firm that managed the shell entity incorporations for the buffer operators Webb had been protecting. The call to the law firm had lasted 11 minutes. It had been made before the calls to the board members, which meant Webb had called his lawyers to confirm the documentation package before he'd sent it to the board, which meant the documentation had been prepared by that law firm, which meant there was a paper trail from the law firm to the documents to Webb's instruction to distribute them, and that paper trail existed in commercial communications records that had nothing to do with organized crime enforcement and everything to do with a man who had been so certain of his own insulation that he had made those calls from a landline in his own building during a meeting he had arranged. Sandra had it compiled by 3 a.m. Dante looked at the completed document, 46 pages, financial records, communication logs, cross-references, and he looked at it for a long time without expression. Then he said, "Send it to Yoon. Tell him I want a board session at 6 a.m., not tomorrow morning, today." "They won't be happy," Rook said. "No," Dante agreed. "They won't." Yeah. The board session happened in a room Zuri was not in. She waited in a smaller office 2 floors below with Costa and a cup of coffee that had been made hours ago and was the temperature of mild regret. Her ribs had moved past the medication's range and were now simply a constant presence, a dull, insistent damage that she breathed around rather than through. She sat with it and didn't think about the board session and didn't think about what was happening in the room above her, because thinking about it would require her to think about what she was now part of, and thinking about that required a framework she hadn't yet built. She thought instead about her apartment, the 4th floor walk-up, the lease in February, the bus route she took every morning to a job that no longer existed, because whatever happened in the room above her, she was not going back to the Holloway estate. That was the one thing she was completely certain of. She thought about what came after, practically, concretely. The way you think about the next thing when the current thing is too large to look at directly. She had fractured ribs and no job, and an employment record that connected her to a billionaire who was currently sitting in his own house with injuries. He couldn't explain to a hospital without explaining why he'd locked his maid in a pantry, which meant Holloway was not going to the hospital, which meant his injuries were his problem in a very quiet and private way. She had 3 weeks of savings. She had a sister in Baltimore she hadn't called in 6 weeks. She thought about calling her sister. She took out her regular phone, not the burner, the real one, and she looked at her sister's name in the contact list, and she didn't call her because it was 3:40 in the morning and because she didn't have a version of this conversation that started anywhere near where it would need to start. She put the phone down and drank the cold coffee and waited. At 4:50 a.m., Rook opened the door. "Done," he said. She looked at him. Board voted 8-4 to table the removal motion. Webb's outreach to Lee, Park, and Cho is formally recorded as unauthorized external interference in syndicate governance. It's not, they won't go to police, that's not how this works. But the record exists, and it means Webb's value to the board as a protector is gone. They know he was managing them. She absorbed this. And Webb? Dante's handling Webb. She looked at him steadily. What does that mean? Rook met her eyes. It means Webb is going to have a conversation with Dante this morning about the terms of his separation from syndicate business. It means the 48-year floor of the Meridian is going to be a lot quieter for the foreseeable future. It means the 3 buffer operators who were counting on Webb to protect them from the Sable Harbor consolidation are going to find out that their protection is no longer available. He paused. Nobody's getting hurt. That's not what this is. Dante doesn't need to hurt Webb. Webb is already finished. He just doesn't know the specific shape of it yet. She nodded slowly. And Holloway, she said. Rook's expression shifted slightly. Holloway's lawyers contacted a syndicate-adjacent firm at 2 a.m., looking to discuss a resolution, quietly. Meaning he's scared. Meaning he's smart enough to be scared, Rook said, which is new from what I understand. She looked at the cold coffee in her hands. Where's Dante? She said. He wants to talk to you, if you're willing. She looked at Rook for a moment. She thought about willing, about what the word meant after a night like this one, about the specific quality of choice that remained available to a person when they'd already made the choice that mattered and everything after it was consequence. Yeah, she said. Okay, I was in the room above, alone now. The board members had gone, Sandra had gone, the table still had coffee cups on it and a residue of the night's work. Pages turned face down. A laptop closed. The specific debris of a crisis that had been managed but not cleaned up. Dante was standing at the window, not looking at anything in particular, just standing, the way a person stands when they've been moving very fast for a very long time and have arrived at the first moment that doesn't require immediate action, and their body doesn't quite know what to do with the absence. He heard her come in. He didn't turn around immediately. She came to stand near the table and set down the empty coffee cup and looked at his back. Yoon told me what you said, he said, in the car, about the patience in Webb's face. Okay. He said you laid it out like someone who'd spent years reading rooms that weren't safe to be wrong in. She said nothing. He turned from the window. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her once before, back in the examination room at the clinic, that stripped-down 2-second version of his face, and this time it lasted longer than 2 seconds. 5. 6. A man deciding something, or having decided it, and working out whether to say it. How are your ribs? He said. Managed, she said. Don't change the subject. Something nearly happened in his face again. I wasn't. You were about to say something, and you went to the ribs instead. A pause. He looked at her. I was going to say thank you, he said. You already said that. In the kitchen, 3 weeks ago. That was for a towel. This is for a longer night, she said. But it's the same thing. He looked at her steadily. She looked back. Outside the window, the sky had begun to change. Not dawn yet, but the first suggestion of dawn's infrastructure. A slight loosening of the dark at the eastern horizon that turned the harbor's surface from black to something closer to deep gray. What do you need? He said. She thought about the apartment and the lease and the job and her sister in Baltimore. I need to not go back to that house, she said. You won't. I need Holloway to understand that clearly, not through a lawyer, not through a resolution discussion. I need him to understand it in a way that makes him permanently uninterested in my existence. Dante looked at her. I can make that happen. I know you can, she said. That's why I'm saying it to you instead of figuring out another way. He nodded once. I need to find work, she said. Not, she paused, choosing words carefully. Not from you. Not from the syndicate. Not from anyone who exists in this world. I need a job that is just a job, that I got on my own, that has nothing to do with tonight. Okay, he said. I'm saying that clearly. I heard it clearly. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about how strange it was to say a true thing to a person and have them receive it as a true thing without negotiating it or softening it or redirecting it back at her. There's a community health organization on the north side, she said. They posted a coordinator position 6 weeks ago. I didn't apply because I thought... She stopped. She thought about why she hadn't applied. Because it required references she didn't think she could provide. Because it was a step up, and steps up required a version of yourself you had to believe in, and she'd been working on believing in a very small version of herself for a long time. I didn't apply, she said. I'm going to apply. You'll get it, he said. You don't know that. No, he agreed. But I know you've been surviving in rooms designed to be survived by someone smaller than you. A room that's just a room is not going to be a problem. She looked at him. She thought about the pantry floor, about the lock clicking on the other side of the door, about 22 minutes of lying in the dark deciding whether she was the kind of person who pressed the button. I need to ask you something, she said. Okay. The phone you left on my kitchen table. Before you left it, before you decided I was someone worth leaving it for, how long did you think about it? He didn't answer immediately. He walked from the window to the table and pulled out a chair and sat in it, and she sat across from him, and the table between them had coffee cups and the residue of a crisis and the very early light beginning to shift the quality of the dark outside the window. I thought about it for 3 days, he said. The Tuesday you were in the kitchen, I thought about the towel for 3 days. What did you think? I thought about the fact that you had every reason to be afraid of me, and you weren't performing not being afraid. He looked at his hands on the table. I've spent a long time in rooms where everyone is performing something. Fear, loyalty, neutrality, whatever the situation requires. You weren't performing anything. You just were there. And you did something useful, and you went back to what you were doing. I handed you a towel. You handed me a towel like I was a person, he said. Not a consequence. Not a threat. Not an opportunity. He looked at her. Do you understand how rare that is? She thought about it. She thought about rare things in the context of her own life. About the specific texture of rarity when you've spent years in rooms where being seen clearly was more dangerous than being invisible. I understand it, she said, from the other direction. He held her eyes. I left the phone because I thought, if she ever needs a way out of something, I want her to have one. That's all I thought. He paused. I didn't think about tonight. I didn't calculate it. He stopped. The towel was a straight line. I tried to draw a straight line back. She looked at him for a long time. You came in 17 minutes, she said. 14, he said. I told you 17 so you'd stop counting. She looked at him. Something moved through her chest that wasn't pain, or was pain of a different kind, the specific ache of a thing that has been held at a distance for so long that allowing it to be close registers as damage. She looked at the table. I'm going to need a few things from the apartment before I go anywhere, she said. There's a bus at... Costa will take you. I don't need... Zuri. His voice was quiet. Not commanding, just there. Let someone drive you. Your ribs are fractured and it's 5 a.m. and you've been awake for... He paused. How long have you been awake? She thought about it. She'd gotten up at 6 the previous morning. It was now approaching 5 a.m. 23 hours, approximately, give or take the time she'd spent on the pantry floor where consciousness had been optional. A while, she said. Let Costa drive you, he said. And then wherever you're going after, wherever you decide that is, tell Costa. He'll take you there too, and that's it. No strings on the drive. No strings on anything. She looked at him. You keep saying that. I keep meaning it. She held his eyes for a moment. She thought about what it cost him to keep meaning it, to have made a calculation that involved no return, in a life built on the architecture of return, and to keep honoring that calculation even after the night it had produced. Okay, she said. Costa can drive me. He nodded. Neither of them moved immediately. Outside, the harbor was becoming visible. The sky at the horizon had shifted from deep gray to something lighter. Not color yet, not quite, but the memory of color, the sky's reminder that light was coming whether the night had resolved itself or not. Webb, she said. Yes. What you said, that he's finished, that he just doesn't know the shape of it yet. She looked at him. What's the shape? Dante was quiet for a moment. The documentation Sandra compiled goes to 3 specific journalists this morning, he said. Not all of it. The financial records, the shell entities, the gap between his reported income and what he's received. He paused. Webb doesn't go to prison. Men like Webb rarely go to prison. But he loses the commissioner's office. He loses the platform that makes him useful to anyone. The shell entities dissolve when they're public. The buffer operators find that their protection arrangement has been front-paged in the morning edition, and they make the calculation that distance from anything syndicate adjacent is their best available option. He looked at the harbor. Webb becomes a man with money and no power, which, for a man like Webb, is its own kind of finished. She thought about Holloway, about the specific quality of men whose power was structural, held in place by systems and relationships and the assumption of their own untouchability, about what happened to that kind of power when the assumption was removed. In Holloway's resolution discussion, she said, I'll meet with his lawyer today, Dante said. The terms will include a signed statement that will never be filed unless it needs to be. Full accounting of what happened in that pantry, in Holloway's own words, witnessed and notarized. His charitable foundation makes an anonymous donation to a domestic violence organization of my choosing. And he leaves you completely alone, permanently, in a way that he understands is the only version of his future in which he continues to have a future. She looked at him. That's not justice, she said. No, he agreed, it's not. She sat with that. She sat with the gap between justice and what was available, the specific terrain of that gap, which she had spent enough of her life navigating to know its contours. It's enough, she said finally. Not because it was what there was. He looked at her steadily. I know. The first real color appeared at the horizon, orange, deep and thin, the very first edge of it, the line where night makes its concession to the day it can't prevent. She looked at it through the window. She thought about the woman she'd been 24 hours ago, moving through a house that trained her to be invisible, managing the moods of a man who had never considered her a person, believing that survival and smallness were the same thing. She thought about the woman sitting in this chair. Not different in any radical sense. Still tired, still in pain, still looking at a future that required building from a position that had been stripped to near nothing. But something had shifted in the architecture of it, some structural thing that she couldn't have named precisely, but could feel in the way she was sitting, in the way she'd spoken during the board meeting preparation, in the way she'd said, "Let me ask you something," to a man who ran organized crime along a major harbor corridor and meant it as a peer. She had been seen, once, clearly, by someone who expected nothing from the scene, and it had reminded her of the size she actually was. That was not a small thing. She stood up carefully, managing the ribs, and picked up the empty coffee cup because it was there, and it needed to go somewhere, and small functional actions were what you used to move yourself from one moment to the next. "I'm going to go get my things," she said. Dante stood. "I'll walk you down," he said. "You don't have to—" "I know," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. Outside, the orange at the horizon was widening, finding the underside of the clouds, turning them colors that hadn't existed 5 minutes ago. They walked out of the room and down the stairs side by side, not touching, and the dry cleaning smell of the floor below came up to meet them, and Costa was in the entryway with his jacket on and his keys in his hand, and he looked at Zuri with the same uncomplicated attentiveness he'd given the road all night. At the door, she stopped. She turned to Dante. "The application," she said, "for the coordinator position. I'm going to apply today, when I wake up." "Okay." "I'm going to put 3 years of household management and scheduling and problem solving in a high-pressure environment on that application, and I'm going to leave the employer's name blank and let the work speak." "That's the right call," he said. She looked at him. "I might call you," she said, "at some point, on the burner." "Okay," he said, "not for a ride, just—" She stopped. "I don't know, I might." "Okay," he said again, and his voice had something in it that wasn't quite warmth, or was warmth of the specific kind that exists in people who have learned to carry it in very contained amounts, because the alternative is being destroyed by it. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she nodded once and turned and walked through the door that Costa held open into the 5:15 a.m. air that was cold and salt-edged and smelled of the harbor coming awake, and she got into the car, and Costa closed the door, and the engine started. She didn't look back at the door. She looked forward, through the windshield, at the street ahead, wet and empty and running in a straight line toward the part of the city where her apartment was, where her things were, where the next version of her life was going to begin in whatever shape she was able to build it. Her ribs hurt. Her shoulder was stiff. She had slept 0 hours in 23 and would need to sleep before the application, before any of it, before the next thing could be approached with anything resembling the clarity it deserved. She looked at her hands in her lap, still steady. She turned that over, that steadiness, where it came from, what it meant that a woman who had spent the worst night of her life still had steady hands. She decided it meant she was still here, that she had not been reduced, that whatever Holloway had thought he was doing when he locked that door, the person on the other side of the door had remained entirely herself, and had then made a series of decisions that a smaller self would not have made, and was now sitting in a car at 5:15 in the morning, watching the city come alive around her with fractured ribs and no job and steady hands. That was enough. That was, for the moment, everything. Costa turned left onto the bridge approach, and the harbor opened up to the right, wide and gray gold now, the dawn working its way across the surface, the industrial lights on the far shore still burning but fading, becoming less necessary, the sky taking over their job with the patient indifference of a sky that has done this every day without exception and will continue to do it regardless of what any particular night contained. She watched it. She thought about her sister in Baltimore. She would call her today, when she woke up, before the application. She would call her and she would not explain everything. Not yet, not all at once. But she would call and she would say, "I'm okay. I had a hard night. I'm okay." And she would mean both things equally. The bridge made its arc over the water, and on the other side, the city settled into its morning version. Delivery trucks, the first pedestrians, a bakery with its lights already on and warm-colored through the window, someone pulling down a security gate from the outside of a closed shop, the small accumulated evidence of a city deciding to begin again. She pressed her hand against her ribs, gently, the way you press a hand against something to remind yourself it's there, rather than to change it. 17 minutes, he'd said. 14, actually. She had pressed a button and a man had moved across the city in 14 minutes, and nothing that followed from that was simple or clean or without cost. And she would be rebuilding from the ground up with fractured ribs and a blank employment line on an application form, and somewhere in a building by the harbor. A man who ran organized crime along a major coast was sitting with his copy of a signed agreement and the first edition of a morning paper that was going to change the shape of the next several months in ways neither of them could fully predict. And across the city, in a house on a ridge, a man named Holloway was sitting in whatever state Dante had left him in, realizing that the woman he had locked in his pantry had made a phone call, and that the phone call had been the last mistake he was ever going to make the luxury of underestimating. The car left the bridge. The city surrounded them again. The harbor disappeared behind buildings. Zuri Bennett looked out the window at the morning and breathed carefully around the damage that was hers now to heal. She had not been saved. She had been seen, and she had been given a tool, and she had used it, and everything after that had been her own. She thought that was the distinction that mattered. She thought she would be thinking about it for a long time. On bus rides, at a new desk in a coordinator's office she hadn't been hired for yet, in the specific quality of quiet in her apartment on a February morning when the lease renewed in her own name for the first time without anything owed to anyone. She would be thinking about it, and somewhere, in the shadow work of a city that ran on arrangements most of its residents would never see, a man who had looked at a towel for 3 days and then left a phone on a kitchen table would be going about the business of the life he'd built, in all its damage and deliberateness, carrying the memory of one impossible night in which he had discovered, at some cost, on a rain-soaked Wednesday, that the only armor that actually holds is the kind you build from being seen by someone who expects nothing back from the seeing. The car stopped in front of her building. Costa looked at her in the rearview mirror. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her with the patient readiness of a man who will wait as long as necessary. She opened the door. She got out. She stood on the sidewalk in front of her building in the cold morning light with her hand against her ribs, and she looked up at the 4th floor. Her windows, unlit, the the city reflected in the glass. And she took one breath, and then another. And then she walked toward the door. The morning came in around her, indifferent and complete, the way mornings always come, without fanfare, without acknowledgement of what the night before contained, simply arriving because arriving is what mornings do. She pushed open the door. She went up the stairs slowly, one at a time. She did not look back.